Resident Evil Requiem dropped a while ago, but I got to play it just now, and I'm genuinely disturbed by the shameless glazing surrounding this game. The usual suspects who snag early access to every major title are already out there controlling the narrative, artificially inflating both sales numbers and public perception, having played the game to completion. Multiple times, I might add. I find myself genuinely wondering how many of these reviewers and the regular players they've successfully influenced into purchasing have clocked more than a few hours. And look, I know this is anecdotal, but a guy I work with asked me the other day if I'd played it. When I said yes, he lit up. It's amazing. Right, I guess. I told him I thought it was mid at best and outright bad depending on which character you're playing as. He was absolutely mortified. When I asked how long he'd played, his answer told me everything I needed to know. That, to me, is the perfect encapsulation of what we're dealing with here. People will sink a couple of hours into a game, be wowed by how pretty it looks, catch a decent performance moment, and immediately crown it a masterpiece before posting a glowing Steam review. Consumer culture is genuinely out of control. I mockingly told him there was no way he could have spent that time doing anything other than holding forward to walk. And as if on cue, he confirmed it was the graphics and cutscenes that made him love it so much. Now, I know he's not representative of everyone, but to me, this feels like a pitch-perfect portrait of the newest wave of Resident Evil fans, or really just uncritical mainstream consumers in general. A new release drops, they fall in love with it on the spot. They accept whatever narrative gets handed to them, and that's the end of it. But let's not waste any more time dwelling on that. Let's get straight into the meat of this thing. From the jump, I want to be clear about what the game is actually doing structurally, because it matters enormously to why I think this campaign falls flat. You start the game as Grace, whose sections lean into survival horror in a way that echoes the early Resident Evil titles, while Leon's sections feel far more at home alongside RE5 or RE6, the heavier, action-oriented entries. Rather than cleanly separating these two wildly different tones into distinct campaigns, the way they've done successfully in past games, the developers instead mash them together in what I can only describe as one enormous, disjointed mess with some of the worst pacing I've experienced in a mainline entry. You essentially play the first half almost entirely as Grace, with tiny Leon segments, we're talking maybe 10 to 15 minutes, scattered throughout. Then the back half flips that, putting you mostly in Leon's shoes with small Grace interludes sprinkled in. It's a bizarre way to structure a game. And while I have no inherent objection to blending horror and action within a single campaign, it is genuinely jarring to be slicing and dicing through enemies with a chainsaw and a hatchet for an extended stretch, then get yanked back to Grace for 2 or 3 hours of slow, methodical navigation, only to be catapulted back into Leon's action for another brief window. I want to be absolutely clear that I'm not exaggerating. You genuinely get Leon segments that clock in at 5 minutes or less, sandwiched between Grace stretches that run 2 hours or more, too. And then the dynamic reverses entirely in the latter half. Splitting these into 2 separate campaigns would have served the pacing infinitely better. And then there's the intro, which I believe is this game's single biggest threat to its long-term replayability. In roughly the first hour and a half of Resident Evil Requiem, all you will have done is watch cutscenes slowly shuffle forward during scripted walking sequences and endure 2-minute or less action segments as Leon that function as little more than tutorials, even granting the ability to skip cutscenes. The unskippable slow walk sections at the start are going to absolutely massacre this game's replay value. And I say that having played through it multiple times in preparation for this, they butcher it. Something that I think is true across both Grace's and Leon's sections, and that strikes me as a fundamental design failure. is that almost every gameplay segment throughout this entire game is formulaic to the point of being completely predictable. Nearly every level dissolves into the same structure. Collect 3 items to progress. 3 cubes in the care center. 2, 3 joint plugs in the basement. 3 detonator parts in Raccoon City as Leon. It never deviates. And compounding this tedium is the fact that healing items are so obscenely abundant in both campaigns that dying genuinely feels difficult even when you play sloppily. My honest read on the campaign's disjointed nature is this: I believe the developers wanted this game to belong entirely to Grace, but that Capcom knew they needed Leon's presence to move units, since a significant portion of the fanbase simply wouldn't have engaged with a Grace-only experience. As a result, Leon's sections feel like exactly what they are: unapologetic fan service, awkwardly grafted onto a story that doesn't quite know what to do with him. And honestly, if they wanted Grace to be the focal point all along, too, maybe don't make her such an insufferable character to follow. That's the real solution, speaking directly to Grace's gameplay segments. The first major section, the Care Center, is, in my view, the best Grace has to offer. And even acknowledging that, I want to be honest that many of her other segments left me cold. What I appreciated about the Care Center is that it at least makes a genuine attempt to balance exploration, puzzle solving, and inventory management within one cohesive space. Unfortunately, even this stronger section comes with glaring problems. The opening portion of Grace's intro gives you so little ammo that you feel practically forced into sneaking around the entire time. But roughly at the midpoint of this first segment, you gain the ability to craft ammo from infected blood. And don't ask me to explain the logic of that, because there isn't any. Shortly after you unlock it, you can produce ammo at an almost comical rate, plus a new tool called the Hemolytic Injector, which causes zombies to explode. I genuinely had over 100 bullets at one point in the early game just from the blood crafting mechanic alone. I'll be fair, I do like what the Hemolytic Injector adds as a strategic tool for dealing with tougher threats like the chef enemy or the blister heads, and it's genuinely useful for preventing zombie resurrection. But the blood crafting system as a whole obliterates what little resource balance this section had. Before it unlocks, you have so little ammo you have to flee from everything. Afterward, you have more than enough to clear the Care Center with ease. It swings violently between both extremes, and there is never any meaningful balance. Following the unfortunate trend Village set, the puzzles here are so laughably easy that I'm honestly not sure why they were included at all. 2/3 of the main puzzles in this section have their answers sitting a few feet away from the input location too, while the third is a scripted event. Some of the minor puzzles have accompanying notes with the relevant text highlighted in yellow too, which feels like the developers quietly acknowledging that they removed the yellow paint from the environment but just relocated it into the notebooks. Because God forbid players are expected to actually read. I'm not a puzzle fanatic by any stretch, but if you're going to make them this transparently lazy, the honest move is to just remove them. Most puzzles in this game are essentially, here's a lock, go find the key. Grace also suffers from a severe overabundance of hide and seek segments. The basement beneath the Care Center, for instance, has you repeatedly repositioning batteries to toggle lights on and off to keep a monster at bay. 2. She can't enter the light. As you move through the area, you take the battery with you, the lights go out, and the monster begins cutting off your path, forcing you to wait it out or loop around. Done sparingly, this might generate some genuine tension. Done as frequently as it is here, it becomes entirely predictable and strips the horror of any real impact. The problem is the same one I keep running into across the entire game. The formulaic repetition makes it impossible to feel scared because I always know exactly when the monster is coming. Later in the water treatment plant, There's a mild variation on this formula where you pull 3 levers to open the roof and shine light down on the monster while it chases you. You even have enough magnum bullets to stun it between lever pulls. But again, this section carries 0 horror weight because the monster is nowhere near fast enough to actually catch you, too, making it feel more tedious than threatening. And then there's what I consider the most egregious pacing decision in the entire game. A late-stage flashback sequence where you play as a young girl wandering through an orphanage, constantly ducking behind corners and hiding under beds. It is punishing on repeat playthroughs because the girl moves unbelievably slowly, and the whole thing drags on for what feels like an eternity. Especially given that it completely interrupts whatever momentum the main story had built. What kind of pacing takes you from Leon motorcycle gun justing with Victor to this? On top of all the hide and seek, there are several scripted chase sequences that I personally found far from frightening, and I think the reason is simple. Grace moves so incredibly slowly that any illusion of danger collapses on itself. The monster should have caught her 10 times over by the time these sequences resolve. The initial chase, when Grace encounters the monster in the care center, for example, blocks you from going directly for the screwdriver and instead forces a slow walk through darkness until the scripted ceiling drop triggers. 2. The later chase with Chunk is even more deflating. There's a safe room genuinely 10 feet from where it starts, and Chunk moves at roughly the speed you'd expect from his design. Where is the tension? I suppose the jump scare is the intended payoff, but then you actually look at Chunk and he's just a heavyset man with bug eyes. That's the horror. What genuinely surprised me is that even across the horror-focused Grace segments, I personally struggled to find much that was scary. And that should have been easy, because I'm someone who is very easily frightened by horror games and movies. When I played Resident Evil Village, there's a sequence involving a giant infant creature that chased me around, and I genuinely could not get through that section without help. Eventually returning to it only with lights on, sound off, and a dog in my lap. That is the person that Resident Evil Requiem, Capcom, failed to scare. The baby in Village worked because it was set up with genuine dread and you never got a great look at it before the chase. What this game does wrong far more often than not is show you the monsters constantly. And on top of that, they look goofy. Real horror builds in your imagination. It uses ambient sound design and lighting to let your mind do the heavy lifting. You cannot simply throw monsters on screen at every opportunity and still expect to generate fear. The first time you encounter the girl, the camera lingers on her for so long that nothing is left to the imagination, and it completely undercuts what should have been a genuinely chilling introduction. It also doesn't help that monsters like Chunk speak to you and deliver ridiculous dialogue that annihilates any sense of dread. His first line is literally stopping. The monster animations frequently veer into accidental comedy. The orphanage sequence has manufactured little girls falling out of the sky and snapping their necks. One of them killing a doctor in a way that looks more like a slapstick gag than horror. One zombie does this bizarre face rub on Grace during a grab that is just completely absurd. What makes all of this worse is the near total absence of ambient tension in the sound design. There is no ominous, foreboding music to prime you for what might be lurking around the next corner. The sound effects don't do the work of making you nervous. Instead, the game leans entirely on cheap jump scares. A lamp falling out of a closet, a body tumbling out as you open a door. And if the lack of ambient music wasn't enough to deflate the atmosphere, Grace's constant moaning and whimpering throughout her entire campaign absolutely finishes the job. By the end of the game, Grace is so flush with resources that she can essentially slaughter everything in the arc with ease. Enemies that were legitimately threatening earlier, the liquors, for instance, are trivially dispatched once the crafting system starts showering you with acid bottles and Molotovs. And aiming as grace feels genuinely bad before you acquire the stabilizer upgrades, particularly on controller with camera shake left on. 2, which it is at maximum intensity by default. Taken together, Grace's campaign sections feel like a drag to play through, not scary, and not especially fun. Moving over to Leon's sections, I'll acknowledge there are genuine bright spots here. The fallen towers in the second half, with the glass floors that let you shoot out panes beneath zombies and cause them to fall, and which are even incorporated meaningfully into the level design, represent some of the most creative set-piece design in the game. The Raccoon City segments were, if I'm being honest, where I had the most fun overall, even if most fun is doing some heavy lifting relative to how middling I found the rest of it. The problem is that these sections mostly amount to mediocre action set pieces backed by subpar gunplay. While Leon has a reasonable arsenal at his disposal, the enemy AI isn't sophisticated enough to make you feel like you need to use any of it with real intention or care. That failure is made worse by the parry mechanic, which I believe breaks this game almost completely. I beat the final boss without taking a single hit because the parry window is so generous that it essentially functions as a get-out-of-jail-free card for every encounter. The idea that Leon, a human being with no superhuman abilities, can parry the attacks of a nemesis the size of a building is not the fun kind of stupid. It's the lazy kind. It also irritates me that the final boss is structurally identical to the final boss from the Resident Evil 2 remake in design. The fight itself differs slightly, but it just feels like evidence of how little imagination was applied to Leon's endgame. And speaking of lazy, there's a throwable item mechanic in his sections that I find genuinely baffling. A button prompt tells you there's a throwable on the ground. 2, you walk up, press the button, and it auto-aims and fires at the nearest enemy. No skill involved, no decision-making, just a prompt you follow. There's also a motorcycle segment where Leon rides through the city shooting at dog enemies. Except you don't control the bike. It drives itself. You only aim the gun. That's a step down from RE6, which at least gave you control of the vehicle when you were the driver. What genuinely frustrates me about Leon's sections is the same thing that frustrated me about their design philosophy. 2, Resident Evil was never about combat. The series built its reputation on careful resource management, oppressive atmosphere, and genuine survival tension. None of those things exist in Leon's campaign. His base inventory is so massive that I never once felt the need to make a difficult decision about what to keep and what to discard. Raccoon City is too brightly lit for Leon to need his flashlight in any meaningful way. 6 Lickers show up at once at one point, and you can wreck all of them without any real effort. Yet in their RE2 remake, a modern game with a comparable mechanical framework, Lickers were a genuine threat that required real resource allocation. The parry makes every enemy encounter feel the same. Press L1, proceed. There's no risk-reward calculation, no tension, no reason to engage thoughtfully. Even the campiness that made Leon so endearing in RE4 has mostly evaporated here. His one-liners in this game feel self-conscious and manufactured rather than genuinely earnest, which is the opposite of what made that material work in the original. I'll also note that Leon now inexplicably carries a hatchet instead of a knife, which feels like a betrayal of something fundamental about the character. The knife, especially that iconic Krauser fight, is part of who Leon is. The hatchet durability system, clearly intended as a soft cap on infinite parrying, is toothless in practice because sharpening is so fast and inexpensive that it imposes essentially no meaningful limitation. The melee combat overall feels janky rather than satisfying, with most encounters reduced to landing a headshot, getting a stun prompt too, and pressing the finisher button. Most of the bosses in Leon's half suffer for the same reasons. Mr. X Hunk, Victor, All of them are heavily designed around the parry, which means they're simultaneously trivial and boring, since a single button invalidates most of what they do. The chunk boss fight early in the game is particularly sad. He gets stuck in the doorway and just stands there while you unload into his head. On my second playthrough, I killed him before he could even clear the threshold. That's not a boss fight. That's a standing target. Beyond the structural issues with the campaign itself, I feel the need to talk about some curious missing features and settings decisions that genuinely don't sit right with me. The absence of a Mercenaries mode is a real blow to this game's legs, especially since I don't believe the campaign has the replay value to compensate. There's no scoring system, no chapter select, and you're committed to playing start to finish every time you boot it up. The first-person OV2, which the game presents as the intended experience for Grace's sections, is so aggressively zoomed in that I found it nauseating to play, and there is no slider to adjust it. The only real fix is to switch to third person, which then comes with its own penalty. During chase sequences, Grace moves faster in third person, but the developers compensate for this by having her constantly stumble. It makes no sense. Both camera modes handle badly, and together they feel like the product of a design team that never fully committed to either option. In typical Capcom fashion, the highest difficulty is locked from the start, which will frustrate the subset of players who want to dive straight into harder modes. The distinction between modern and classic play modes is also nearly non-existent in practice. Classic is supposed to simulate the ribbon-based save system of older entries, but ribbon cases and blood are so abundantly scattered throughout that the classic experience barely differs from just having autosaves. New Game Plus doesn't allow you to carry over weapon upgrades and inventory the way Village did, replacing that system with challenge points for cosmetics and infinite ammo that misses what made NG Fuff feel rewarding in the first place. And then there are the baffling default settings: motion blur on, camera shake on at maximum intensity, 2, and film grain applied at a level you cannot remove. Why cap our ability to tune our own experience? Let me be direct. The story and characters in this game are so completely and thoroughly beyond saving that it's almost difficult to articulate. Every question this narrative raises is answered with 3 more questions, and the deeper you descend into it, the worse it becomes. Death Stranding levels of incoherence, and I mean that. We're introduced to Grace as an FBI agent who doubles as a tech analyst, too. Her director sends her to the Renwood Hotel to investigate a string of strange murders. A hotel, I should note, where Grace's mother was murdered right in front of her 20 years prior. This man is aware of that history. He knows she's a stuttering, nervous wreck, and he sends her there alone. I have concluded that this director is either secretly working for the villain, for which there is zero evidence, 2, or he is simply an irredeemable incompetent who thought sending stuttering Stanley to the site of her childhood trauma was sound professional judgment. We find out shortly after that Victor, the main villain, planted the original body specifically to lure Grace to that hotel. When she arrives, we get a flashback of her mother's murder that plays out in the most baffling way possible. After the lights go out and they're attacked by a mysterious man, Grace's mother shoots him. Reasonable so far. But then this man, having been shot multiple times, silently teleports behind Grace's mom, kills her, and then immediately collapses dead into a table holding a lantern, which sets the hotel ablaze. He has the ability to magically teleport and survive multiple gunshot wounds for exactly as long as it takes to fulfill his narrative function, and then he's gone. And this raises a question the game never answers. Why would Victor send an assassin to kill the one person holding information he wants and potentially kill the girl he believes is the key to everything. An in-game file reveals Victor has known about Grace's existence since 1988. Based on that, Victor's plan apparently involved waiting 30 years to randomly murder Grace's mother and then waiting another decade to renew his pursuit of Grace at all. I still genuinely don't understand how Victor learned about Elpis or Grace in the first place, since the game tells us Spencer never shared that information with anyone but Alyssa. The Resident Evil wiki attributes it to Victor being a former Spencer researcher whose reason for targeting Alyssa is that she was investigating his Elpis experiments. But the wiki's own source, Alyssa's journal, only shows she noticed Victor following her, not that she was investigating anything. The game's own internal logic doesn't hold. Grace gets bitten by an infected cop, but never turns, which the game implies is either immunity or a non-transmissible T-virus strain, a foreshadow for a later plot point. She eventually runs into Victor in the hotel, gets knocked out, and wakes up in his clinic just as Leon arrives in the city. Victor infects several civilians with a dart gun to occupy Leon and buy himself an escape too, which is the kind of collateral damage villainy that makes you wonder about his long-term strategy. Sherry points Leon toward the clinic address. When Leon arrives at the clinic, a scene that generated significant controversy in pre-release footage plays out exactly as anticipated. A nurse welcomes him in. He watches her slowly get chainsawed from behind by a zombie doctor with more than enough time to intervene. He does nothing. He sees the doctor coming, has his weapon drawn, and does nothing, then makes a wisecrack after watching this woman die. Whether Leon is morally inert or genuinely evil is left unresolved, and I'm not sure the game is in on the joke. Victor then confronts Leon and immediately incapacitates him in a chokehold that Leon could have avoided by taking literally one step backward. This scene is made additionally baffling by the fact that Victor then leaves Grace to wander freely through a clinic full of dangerous zombies, despite believing her to be the key to his entire plan, too. He has cameras everywhere. He knows where she is. He just doesn't care. Grace's introduction to Emily in a basement cell manages to expose her as an almost remarkably inept observer. A man outside the cell, bleeding out with his final breath, warns her not to approach the girl. Grace, who is supposedly an FBI tech analyst, has to ask the child if she's blind despite the cataracts being visible, and the girl clearly reading Braille. She doesn't notice the dead body, doesn't register the giant hole in the ceiling that appears later, and most damning of all, fails to connect the doll in a nearby room to the identical doll in the girl's cell, too, which would have told her that a girl who was once near Emily had transformed into a monster, strongly suggesting Emily would do the same. Anyone paying the smallest amount of attention could see what was going to happen with Emily, not Grace. And what makes it genuinely infuriating is that Grace then endangers Emily for no reason at all. The final medallion puzzle in the care center has one input in Braille without visible symbols above it. Rather than writing down the Braille pattern from the other machines and applying it to this one, which would have taken minimal thought. Grace instead carries a blind child to the puzzle so Emily can read it for her. This triggers the monster girl, who immediately grabs Emily and descends into the basement. Grace endangered the child she was supposedly protecting through a complete failure to observe and reason. And then the game uses this stupidity retroactively to justify every future dumb decision Grace makes. Because we've now established that she is just like this. Getting back to the broader plot, Grace eventually retrieves a notebook and disc her late mother had hidden behind a painting in the hotel, which, remarkably, survived the massive fire that burned the building down. She and Leon end up at a helicopter. Grace fights through a lab section, overhears that Victor wants her because she's the key to a bioweapon called Elpis, and then Victor arbitrarily self-destructs the facility before verifying Grace hasn't already been killed by the zombies he left her with. During the helicopter escape, Grace doesn't shoot the zombies actively breaking through the window, which results in the pilot being grabbed and killed when the branch torques the helicopter. A scene that somehow has the branch teleport through the pilot's chest at a 90-degree angle, because physics are optional in this game. After Leon rescues Grace and she escapes to the water treatment plant, the story pivots to the sequence that I think most clearly illustrates how little this game respects the characters it inherited. After Grace kills the monster that Marie had transformed into, Leon then kills Emily's monster form to protect them both. Grace's response is to shove Leon's gun back at him and leave in a fury, even though she herself just killed a little girl who had turned into a monster mere minutes ago. She never connects those two things. And then, at the top of a staircase, Victor is waiting to greet her, accompanied by Zeno, a new villain introduced at this moment. They tell Grace she's the key to Elpis, and she just goes with them. She follows the people who have been choking her, kidnapping her, binding her to a table, and drawing her blood, because apparently at no point in her FBI training did anyone explain basic threat assessment. Leon somehow lets this happen in full earshot and doesn't intervene. He then drives to Raccoon City and calls Sherry to discuss rescuing Grace. 2. The woman he just watched walk away with the villains without lifting a finger. The same man is now willing to risk everything to save her. In Raccoon City, Leon assembles a detonator, drives a motorcycle through a gate, and confronts Victor, who now tries to kill him with a rocket launcher. Despite having had multiple opportunities earlier in the story to kill Leon and choosing instead to take him captive for no disclosed reason. The motorcycle chase culminates in both of them gun jousting. 2 men with firearms who, for reasons that transcend logic, drive toward each other in a straight line and wait until they're inches apart to fire. Victor somehow misses every shot despite having a straight line of sight the entire time. He ends up rolling off a bridge. As an isolated moment, there's a genuine charm to the sheer insanity of it, what you might call dumb cinema. And I'll acknowledge it's one of the rare moments in this game I found genuinely entertaining rather than just absurd. Zeno then reveals to Grace that she was created, that clones were made of her, but that she is the original. The game then immediately cuts to that orphanage flashback sequence you play as Chloe, a manufactured little girl already alive in 1983. While Grace wasn't born until the early 90s, the timeline does not add up. How Zeno looks at a file showing a supposed Grace clone from 1983 and concludes Grace is the original when she was a teenager in 2003 is beyond explanation. He doesn't know what he's looking at, apparently. The game then deploys Mr. X and Hunk as though simply referencing better games earns the same reaction those games originally generated. They are thrown on screen with no substance, no purpose, no payoff. Pure key jingling. The canon ending of this game deserves particular scrutiny because I find it almost impressively incoherent. Grace, operating under the belief that Elpis is a mind control weapon and that any wrong password will destroy it permanently, has told both Zeno and Leon multiple times that she genuinely doesn't know the password. Yet she then decides not to destroy it, too, which was her stated plan, and instead releases it to a psychotic murderer on the basis of a hunch. Her reasoning, Spencer regretted what he did, so the password must be Hope, because she heard Spencer and Alyssa use the word in old video footage. That's it. And then, despite having been established throughout the entire game as someone who can't identify cataracts on a blind child, 2, can't connect 2 identical dolls in the same building and walked willingly into a helicopter with her kidnappers, Grace suddenly becomes omniscient. She not only guesses the correct password on a whim, but instantly deduces that Elpis is an antiviral and not a weapon, despite zero evidence pointing her in that direction. 2. She then tries to stop Zeno from injecting himself, because if he had listened to her, he would have known it was an antiviral. 2. Wouldn't have injected it expecting a power-up, wouldn't have lost his abilities, and would have simply killed them both. The game accidentally reveals that Grace's competence is inversely correlated with the plot's needs. Victor, watching this unfold, marvels at Spencer's genius. The plan, apparently, was to create an anarchy by destabilizing global order. Then rightly calls Zeno a cheap imitation and kills him. Zeno's entire arc in this game amounts to establish he's a threat by killing some soldiers, dodge Leon's bullets Wesker style to look powerful, contribute nothing to the lore, have no backstory, and then inject himself with an unknown substance, lose his powers, and die without a boss fight to the film's secondary villain. That is the totality of his contribution. Victor, now revealed as a nemesis-type creature, has the final boss battle with Leon. A fight that, thanks to the parry, I completed without taking a hit. After that, Grace and Leon are stranded at the bottom of the arc for approximately 30 seconds before Chris Redfield materializes with his troops to rescue them in a sequence vaguely reminiscent of him showing up with a tank near the end of Village. And then Emily, the child Leon allegedly missed the vitals on while blasting her giant flesh monster form with a magnum, too. Turns out to be alive and gets adopted by Grace. No consequences for anything. Leon's explanation is that he missed her vitals. That's the explanation. The game ends on a cliffhanger involving an unknown organization, possibly the Connections. That has neutralized the BSAA and is moving in. I assume this is set up for DLC or a sequel. Before I wrap up, I feel I need to draw specific attention to something that bothers me as someone who has followed this franchise for a long time. This game retroactively damages the most important character in the entire Resident Evil mythology. Oswald Spencer is reframed here as a man who experienced a change of heart late in life, with Grace's post-game report noting testimonies that he was senile in his final years. Neither of these things is consistent with what we know about Spencer from the Resident Evil 5 Lost in Nightmares DLC. His final words in that cutscene, delivered as he laments his mortality and what was taken from him, are those of a man whose vision for godhood never wavered. He is entirely lucid throughout. I was to become a god, creating a new world with an advanced race of human beings. This does not sound like a senile old man having second thoughts. He and Wesker hold an articulate, pointed exchange before his death. The retcon is not subtle, and it serves a story that, in my assessment, isn't worthy of the sacrifice. I want to be clear that I'm not claiming I can't understand why some people enjoy this game, but the review scores this thing is pulling on Metacritic and elsewhere feel genuinely disconnected from the product being reviewed. The game does perform well technically, at least on PS5, and the cutscenes look undeniably impressive, too. And apparently that combination is sufficient to put a title in serious Game of the Year conversation in the current release landscape. It doesn't help that the influencers who received early access keys worked overtime securing the narrative before anyone else could push back. Capcom's ability to mobilize their biggest promoters in the launch window is, I'll admit, tactically impressive. What I find genuinely funny is how many people hated Resident Evil 6 and love this game, despite the fact that half of Requiem is Leon sections that are functionally Resident Evil 6. What is the motorcycle just, if not something lifted directly from RE6 DNA? Why do we love this and hate that? My theory? This is the hot new thing, and when RE6 came out, there were actually other strong releases for it to compete against. Now, a game that simply functions is already a standout for the year. The glowing reviews and massive sales figures demonstrate that even after the Capcom stumbles with the Dead Rising remake and Monster Hunter Wilds, there are still enormous numbers of people prepared to buy anything with Capcom's name on it if the review scores look favorable. I genuinely like to believe this game won't age well once people move through the honeymoon phase. But RE5 and RE6 still have their passionate defenders to this day, which tells me I probably shouldn't hold my breath.